Shako. Shako.
Thank you. What's up, everyone? So I thought we're coming up to Yom Ha'atzmaut next week, as we all know. We'll discuss one aspect tonight. So there's a great debate and discussion regarding the saying of Hallel on Yom Ha'atzmaut. It's big sugya, big halachic sugya. Obviously, don't have time now to cover the entire thing. But there's one aspect of this discussion which I think resonates very, very strongly in our current reality, what has happened this year, that I want to just have a look at. So, first of all, the whole thing begins, where do we have the ability, where do we have the Hava Mina to begin with, that we can introduce a new day when we say Hallel? There's two primary sugyas in the Gemara which discusses this. First of all, we know that there are days on the Jewish calendar which were not in the time of the Chumash, and they were added on later, namely Chanukah and Purim. And the Gemara tells us, the Gemara Masechet Megillah, Sestan Rabbanan 48 Nevi'im v'sheva Nevi'ot nitnabu lahem l'Yisrael. We had 48 prophets and 7 female prophets. V'lo pachtu v'lo tiru ma shekatuv b'Torah. The Nevi'im, nonetheless, could not add and could not subtract from the mitzvot, from the Yamim Tovim, which are written in the Torah, with one exception, says the Gemara, Chutz Mikra Megillah. They added in the mitzvah of Mikra Megillah, and along with that is all the other mitzvot of Purim. Right, so it says, where did they have the authority to do this? What is this based on? My darush. Says Rabbi Chia bar Avin Amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha, Uma me'avdut lecherut amrin an shira. Just as we say on Pesach, when we went from slavery to freedom, right, from avdut lecherut, for that we say shira. For that we sing Hallel, we say praise to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Mimita l'chaim lo kol sheken. Is it not a kal v'chomer if we have the obligation and the responsibility to sing Shira when we went from slavery to freedom, when we went from death to life, which was the situation at Purim, all the more so. So again, although it's funny because the Gemara starts off talking about Mikra Megillah, and then it goes on to the topic of Shira, which is essentially Hallel. So immediately, as you'd expect, the Gemara says, okay, you've just proven to me why we should say Hallel on Purim. Why don't we say Hallel on Purim? One of the answers the Gemara gives, discussed in the past, but one of the answers the Gemara gives is that the Mikra Megillah, that itself is Hallel. It's a different form of Hallel, and therefore other answers as well. But essentially, that is the one source, that whenever we have a situation of got Mita l'chayim, going from death to life, the Jewish people are saved. So there we have the responsibility, we have the obligation to say Hallel. There is another Gemara Masechet Pesachim. This is, again, we spoke about Pesach, that's in Megillah, Gemara Pesachim as well, which tells us, again, Nevi'im shebenehem tiknu le'en Yisrael, she'omrim oto meaning Hallel, al kol pelek upelek v'al kol tzara v'tzara shelo tavo alehem. Meaning any time that there's a situation of great distress from which the Jewish people are saved, so there was a takana of the Nevi'im that we should say Hallel over that instance. When they're redeemed, they would say Hallel over that redemption, over that salvation. Rashi over there, very interestingly, Rashi says Kagon Chanukah. He says just like on Chanukah. What is Rashi adding with those two words? Why does he have to tell me specifically that it's Chanukah? We'll see in a moment what some of the Mefarshim say about that. So those are the two sources, the Gemara Megillah, Gemara Pesachim, which really seem to open it, to expand the net, as you would say, to say when we have this kind of salvation which takes place, so one would say Hallel. Now, there's another Gemara, which is very limiting, very restricting, the Gemara Narchim, which lists the days upon which we say Hallel. It says we have 18 days in the year in which we say Hallel, no more, no less. These are the days. Says the Gemara, Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Mishum ben Yotzadak, 18 yamim shayachid gomer bahen et Hallel. Okay, that's going to be the question. The Gemara says that the individual says Hallel on these 18 days. What does it mean, the individual? Right? We know you come to shul, you daven with a minyan. The whole tzibur says it. It's not one person saying it by themselves. So why does it say? But the Gemara here says Hayachid, and then it says the days. It says Shmona Yamei Chag, Shmona Yamei Chanukah, Yom Tov Rishon Shel Pesach, Yom Tov Shel Atzeret. Okay, the different Chagim. Those are the days of which we say Hallel Shalem. Doesn't include the other days of Pesach, and it's a Hallel B'dilug. Doesn't include Rosh Chodesh, which is a minhag, which came later. That's for another time. But in any event, it limits it to these days. This Gemara does not seem to give us the option to add on and to have other days on which you'd say Hallel. Now, one of the things Tosfot asks, says, why does it say a Yachid? It says these are the days on which the individual says the Hallel. So Tosfot here says something fascinating. He says Yachid does not mean one individual, one person by themselves, but it's Yachid as opposed to, not even as opposed to Tzibur, as opposed to the community. But which Tzibur? The Tzibur of Klal Yisrael, of the entire Jewish people. He says in this context, anything that is less than the entire Jewish people, so Kilat, Beit Knesset, Nasi, that is considered Yachid. That's not the entire Jewish people. And he says when the Gemara here says these are the days on which the Yachid, meaning anything less than the whole Jewish people, have only got the days which have been prescribed for us to say Hallel. However, could there be another day? Could there be additional days on which, not the Yachid, but on which the entire Kol Yisrael would say Hallel? The answer is yes. There are such days. There could be such days, and that relates back to the other Gemarot. He quotes the Gram Psachim, which we saw, which is I'll call Tzarav Tzarav, I'll call Perek for Perek, that they would come and they would say the Hallel. In other words, and what comes out of this is, says also, if you have a salvation which occurs for the entire Jewish people, not just for a segment of the Jewish people, that would be a day on which you could, and potentially would be obligated to say Hallel on as well. Okay, now the Poskim talk about this. It's very interesting. The Chidah proves this from something which Rashi said. I mentioned in the Gram Psachim, right, which says that these are the days whenever there's a salvation, you can say Hallel. Rashi says Kagon Chanukah. Says like Chanukah. Says the Chidah. It must be. We know what Chanukah is. We know, right, the Gemara tells us that we say Hallel on Chanukah. We know what happened. We understand. It's not a very complicated Gemara either. There's a trouble. There's a distress. They get saved. There's a redemption. Okay. Why do you have to tell me like on Chanukah? Kagon Chanukah. What are you adding? So he says something which is a little bit puzzling because the point basically goes from Tosfot, but the proof of it from Rashi is not so understandable. Says the Chidah, what Rashi is trying to tell us is exactly the point that Tosfot made, which is that when the Gemara says there are times when there's been a tzara, there's been a distress, there's been a redemption, salvation, if it's something which affected the entire Jewish people all across the world, so that is a day in which you could say Hallel. If it's something which happens to one community, now there are other practices in terms of Sudat Hodaya and how that's expressed if a community has its own salvation, but they wouldn't add in Hallel. And he says that's why Rashi told us Kagon Chanukah, because Kagon Chanukah to teach you that it's something which affects the entire Jewish people, then that's where you say Hallel. But if it's anything less than that, you wouldn't. So Rav Ovadia Yosef has got in Yabia Omer a long tshuva discussing all the different aspects of, by his standards, not so long, but it's long. But it's discussing all the different aspects of whether we would say Hallel with the bracha, without a bracha, what are the reasons, yes, no, what. And he quotes this Chidah, who quotes a number of the Rishonim. And he says, I don't understand. Because the Chidah says that it has to be something which affected all of Am Yisrael. And your proof for that is Rashi said, Kagon Chanukah. But Chanukah wasn't all of Am Yisrael. Not everybody was there. Not everybody was a threat. Not everybody was here. So what's your proof? So he says, no, Chanukah is different. Chanukah is different because Chanukah was to do with the Beit HaMikdash. And the minute that it's the Beit HaMikdash, that's considered Kol Yisrael. But nonetheless, but the principle still stands. Meaning you have many Rishonim and many Achronim who say that it needs to be Hallel only on something which affects all of Klal Yisrael. So the next stage of the argument goes like this. So now we get to Yom Ha'atzmaut. The truth is there's a lot of confusion on many, many different levels, many different aspects. You ask people, even people who say Hallel with a bracha on Yom Ha'atzmaut, why do you say Hallel? What's the reason? What's the halachic reasoning behind it? Many people will not be able to tell. But if we go on the premise that it's based on the idea of Mimita L'Chayim, as the Gemara told us, there was a salvation here from death to life. Okay, where exactly, which salvation, what are we talking about? So you might say, we got to do 1948, we were at war, we had the War of Independence, and what happened? There was the salvation from there, we were rescued. Okay, if that's the case, you'll then ask the next question. We'll just talk about this on Shabbos, but you'll ask the next question, which is if it's to do with the war specifically, so then why do you celebrate on Yom Ha'atzmaut, the day the state was declared? That's when the war began, at least in that phase. Do it on the day when the ceasefire was declared, right? But so that's a separate question. But seemingly, the idea of Mita L'Chayim is a broader issue over here. The fact of, and I think that now, today, we can very much understand this, unfortunately, under tragic circumstances. But, and if we take a little bit of a broader view of history, look at where the Jewish people were, not just in 1948, but in the 1930s and the 1940s, and where we had come from. and what establishing a state and now having an army and being here and being able to defend ourselves with or without support from other countries, right? But what that did, that is the Mitzvah L'Chaim. And then so the question is, because there are those who say you shouldn't say Hallel Yom Ha'atzmaut. Why? Because it didn't affect all of Klal Yisrael. We're talking about the population that was here, that was in Eretz Yisrael, was at the time 600,000 out of whatever many million. So you had many Jews in other places, and therefore it's not that. Again, I think that there are other arguments, there are other discussions to be had. As I said, we're just dealing with this one aspect here in the short framework of time that we have right now. But the establishment of the state, the declaration of the state, and yes, there are things to be fixed, and yes, we're still fighting wars. Yeah, we know we're still fighting for our lives, and it's not foolproof. But look at what is going on around the world. Look at what is going on campuses in every country in the world, probably including this one. Look at what's happening in the streets and where Jews are being attacked, and to say that the existence of the state and the existence of the IDF and the existence of everything we have here does not affect and does not dramatically improve the safety of Jews all over the world. To my mind, that sounds like a ludicrous argument. Again, you can prove maybe or not prove, but I think logically, looking at it, what we have here and what was established here and what was created on this day of Yom Ha'atzmaut, that is something which affected and continues to affect every single Jew around the world. So in terms of this question, again, not everybody even accepts the premise that it needs to be. There are those who say if you have a salvation of this magnitude, even if it's half the Jewish people, whatever, but that would be that you would still say Hallel over it. But at least in terms of this aspect, if we say we require the miracle to be something which affected the entire Jewish population, so I think we can safely say that Yom Ha'atzmaut is something which affected and overall affected positively the entire Jewish people. Rabbi Hanania ben Akash omer HaKadosh Baruch Hu lezakot Yisrael לפי איך בא להם תורה מצוות, שניהם עד בזמן צדקו יגדיל תורה